Neither Sabriel nor Mogget mentioned the happenings of the previous night when they awoke. Sabriel, bathing her seriously swollen nose in an inch of water from her canteen, found that she didn't particularly want to remember a waking nightmare, and Mogget was quiet, in an apologetic way. Despite what happened later, freeing Mogget's alter ego, or whatever it was, had saved them from certain destruction by the wind. As she'd expected, dawn had brought some light to the sinkhole, and as the day progressed, this had grown to a level approximating twilight. Sabriel could read and see things close by quite clearly, but they merged into indistinct gloom 20 or 30 yards away. Not that the sinkhole was much larger than that, perhaps 100 yards in diameter, not the 50 she'd guessed at when she was coming down. The entire floor of it was paved, with a circular drain in the middle, and there were several tunnel entrances into the sheer rock walls, tunnels which Sabriel knew she would eventually have to take, as there was no water in the sinkhole. There seemed little chance of rain either. It was cool, but nowhere near as cold as the plateau near Aborson's house. The climate was mitigated by proximity to the ocean, and an altitude that could easily be sea level or below, for in daylight Sabriel could see that the sinkhole was at least 100 yards deep. Still, with a half-full canteen of water gurgling by her side, Sabriel was quite content to slouch upon her slightly scorched pack and apply herbal creams to her bruises, and a poultice of evil-smelling tamarill leaves to her strange sunburn. Her nose was a different matter when it came to treatment. It wasn't broken, merely hideous, swollen and encrusted with dried blood, which hurt too much to clean off completely. Mogget, after an hour or so of sheepish silence, sauntered off to explore, refusing Sabriel's offer of hard cakes and dried meat for breakfast. She expected he'd find a rat or something equally appetizing instead. Anyway, she was quite pleased he was gone. The memory of the free magic beast that lay within the little white cat was still disturbing. Even so, when the sun had risen to become a little disk surrounded by the great circumference of that sinkhole's rim, she started to wonder why he hadn't come back. Levering herself up, she limped over to the tunnel he'd chosen, using her sword as a walking stick and complaining quietly as every bruise reminded her of its location. Of course, just as she was lighting a candle at the tunnel entrance, Mogget reappeared behind her. "Looking for me?" he mewed innocently. "Who else?" replied Sabriel. "Have you found anything? Anything useful, I mean. Water, for instance?" "Useful?" mused Mogget, rubbing his chin back along his two outstretched front legs. "Perhaps. Interesting, certainly. Water? Yes." "How far away?" asked Sabriel, all too aware of her bruise-limited mobility. "And what does interesting mean? Dangerous?" "Not far. By this tunnel," replied Mogget. "There is a little danger getting there. A trap and a few other oddments, but nothing that will harm you. As to the interesting part, you will have to see for yourself, Aborson." "Sabriel," said Sabriel automatically, as she tried to think ahead. She needed at least 2 days' rest, but no more than that. Every day lost before she found her father's corporeal body might mean disaster. She simply had to find him soon. A mordicant, shadow hands, gore crows. It was now all too clear that some terrible enemy was arrayed against both father and daughter. That enemy had already trapped her father, so it had to be a very powerful necromancer, or some greater dead creature. Perhaps this Caragor. "I'll get my pack," she decided, trudging back, Mogget slipping backwards and forwards across her path like a kitten, almost tripping her, but always just getting out of the way. Sabriel put this down to inexplicable catness and didn't comment. As Mogget had promised, the tunnel wasn't long, and its well-made steps and cross-hatched floor made passage easy, save for the part where Sabriel had to follow the little cat exactly across the stones, to avoid a cleverly concealed pit. Without Mogget's guidance, Sabriel knew she would have fallen in. There were magical wardings, too. Old inimical spells lay like moths in the corners of the tunnel, waiting to fly up at her, to surround and choke her with power. But something checked their first reaction and they settled again. A few times, Sabriel experienced a ghostly touch, like a hand reaching out to brush the charter mark on her forehead. And almost at the end of the tunnel, she saw 2 guard sendings melting into the rock, the tips of their halberds glinting in her candlelight before they, too, merged into stone. "Where are we going?" she whispered nervously, as the door in front of them slowly creaked open, without visible means of propulsion. "Another sinkhole," Mogget said matter-of-factly. "It is where the first blood—" He choked, hissed, and then rephrased his sentence rather drably, with, "It is interesting." "What do you mean?" Sabriel began, but she fell silent as they passed the doorway, magical force suddenly tugging at her hair, her hands, her surcoat, the hilt of her sword. Mogget's fur stood on end, and his collar rotated halfway around of its own accord, till the charter marks of binding were uppermost and clearly readable, bright against the leather. Then they were out, standing at the bottom of another sinkhole, in a premature twilight, for the sun was already slipping over the circumscribed horizon of the sinkhole rim. This sinkhole was much wider than the first, perhaps a mile across, and deeper, say, 600 or 700 feet. Despite its size, the entire vast pit was sealed off from the upper air by a gleaming web-thin net, which seemed to merge into the rim wall about a quarter of the way down from the surface. Sunlight had given it away, but even so, Sabriel had to use her telescope to see the delicate diamond pattern weave clearly. It looked flimsy, but the presence of several desiccated bird corpses indicated considerable strength. Sabriel guessed the unfortunate birds had dived into the net, eyes greedily intent on food below. In the sinkhole itself, there was a considerable, if uninspiring, vegetation, mostly stunted trees and malformed bushes. But Sabriel had little attention to spare for the trees, for in between each of these straggling patches of greenery, there were paved areas, and on each of these paved areas rested a ship. 14 open-decked single-mast longboats, their black sails set to catch a non-existent wind, oars out to battle an imaginary tide. They flew many flags and standards, all limp against mast and rigging, but Sabriel didn't need to see them unfurled to know what strange cargo these ships might bear. She'd heard of this place, as had every child in the northern parts of Encelstier, close to the Old Kingdom. Hundreds of tales of treasure, adventure, and romance were woven around this strange harbor. "Funerary ships," said Sabriel. "Royal ships." She had further confirmation that this was so, for there were binding spells woven into the very dirt her feet scuffed at the tunnel entrance. Spells of final death that could only have been laid by an abortion. No necromancer would ever raise any of the ancient rulers of the Old Kingdom. "The famous burial ground of the first... the kings and queens of the Old Kingdom," pronounced Mogget, after some difficulty. He danced around Sabriel's feet, then stood on his hind legs and made expansive gestures, like a circus impresario in white fur. Finally, he shot off into the trees. "Come on! There's a spring! Spring! Spring!" he caroled, as he leapt up and down in time with his words. Sabriel followed at a slower pace, shaking her head and wondering what had happened to make Mogget so cheerful. She felt bruised, tired, and depressed, shaken by the free magic monster, and sad about the paper wing. They passed close by 2 of the ships on their way to the spring. Mogget led her a merry dance round both of them, in a mad circumnavigation of twists, leaps, and bounds, but the sides were too high to look in, and she didn't feel like shinning up an oar. She did pause to look at the figureheads, imposing men, one in his 40s, the other somewhat older. Both were bearded, had the same imperious eyes, and wore armor similar to Sabriel's, heavily festooned with medallions, chains, and other decorations. Each held a sword in his right hand and an unfurling scroll that turned back on itself in their left, the heraldic representation of the charter. The third ship was different. It seemed shorter and less ornate, with a bare mast devoid of black sails. No oars sprang from its sides, and as Sabriel reached the spring that lay under its stern, she saw uncaulked seams between the planking, and realized that it was incomplete. Curious, she dropped her pack by the little pool of bubbling water and walked around to the bow. This was different too, for the figurehead was a young man, a naked young man, carved in perfect detail. Sabriel blushed a little, for it was an exact likeness, as if a young man had been transformed from flesh to wood, and her only prior experience of naked men was in clinical cross-sections from biology textbooks. His muscles were lean and well-formed, his hair short and tightly curled against his head. His hands, well-shaped and elegant, were partly raised, as if to ward off some evil. The detail even extended to a circumcised penis, which Sabriel glanced at in an embarrassed way, before looking back at his face. He was not exactly handsome, but not displeasing. It was a responsible visage, with the shocked expression of someone who has been betrayed and only just realized it. There was fear there, too, and something like hatred. He looked more than a little mad. His expression troubled her, for it seemed too human to be the result of a woodcarver's skill, no matter how talented. Too lifelike, Sabriel muttered, stepping back from the figurehead, hand falling to the hilt of her sword, her magical senses reaching out, seeking some trap or deception. There was no trap, but Sabriel did feel something in or around the figurehead, a feeling similar to that of a dead revenant, but not the same, a niggling sensation that she couldn't place. Sabriel tried to identify it, while she looked over the figurehead again, carefully examining him from every angle. The man's body was an intellectual problem now, so she looked without embarrassment, studying his fingers, fingernails, and skin, noting how perfectly they were carved, right down to the tiny scars on his hands, the product of sword and dagger practice. There was also the faint sign of a baptismal charter mark on his forehead, and the pale trace of veins on his eyelids. That inspection led her to certainty about what she detected, but she hesitated about the action that should be taken, and went in search of Mogget. Not that she put a lot of faith in advice or answers from that quarter, given his present propensity towards behaving as a fairly silly cat, though perhaps this was a reaction to his brief experience of being a free magic beast again, something that might not have happened for a millennium. The cat form was probably a welcome relief. In fact, no advice at all could be had from Mogget. Sabriel found him asleep in a field of flowers near the spring, his tail and patty paws twitching to a dream of dancing mice. Sabriel looked at the straw-yellow flowers, sniffed one, scratched Mogget behind the ears, then went back to the figurehead. The flowers were cat balm, explaining both Mogget's previous mood and his current somnolence. She would have to make up her own mind. "So," she said, addressing the figurehead like a lawyer before a court, "you are the victim of some free magic spell and necromantic trickery. Your spirit lies neither in life nor death, but somewhere in between. I could cross into death and find you near the border, I'm sure. But I could find a lot of trouble as well. Trouble I can't deal with in my current pathetic state. So what can I do? What would Father, Aborson, or any Aborson, do in my place?" She thought about it for a while, pacing backwards and forwards, bruises temporarily forgotten. That last question seemed to make her duty clear. Sabriel felt sure her father would free the man. That's what he did. That was what he lived for. The duty of an Aborson was to remedy unnatural necromancy and free magic sorcery. She didn't think further than that, perhaps due to the injudicious sniffing of the cat balm. She didn't even consider that her father would probably have waited until he was fitter, perhaps till the next day. After all, this young man must have been incarcerated for many years, his physical body transformed into wood, and his spirit somehow trapped in death. A few days would make no difference to him, and Aborson didn't have to immediately take on any duty that presented itself. But, for the first time since she'd crossed the wall, Sabriel felt there was a clear-cut problem for her to solve. An injustice to be righted, and one that should involve little more than a few minutes on the very border of death. Some slight sense of caution remained with her, so she went and picked up Mogget, placing the dozing cat near the feet of the figurehead. Hopefully he would wake up if any physical danger threatened. Not that this was likely, given the wards and guards on the sinkhole. There were even barriers that would make it difficult to cross into death, and more than difficult for something dead to follow her back. All in all, it seemed like the perfect place to undertake a minor rescue. Once more, she checked the bells, running her hands over the smooth wood of the handles, feeling their voices within, eagerly awaiting release. This time it was Rana she freed from its leather case. It was the least noticeable of the bells, its very nature lulling listeners, beguiling them to sleep or inattention. Second thoughts brushed at her like doubting fingers, but she ignored them. She felt confident, ready for what would only be a minor stroll in death, amply safeguarded by the protections of this royal necropolis. Sword in one hand, bell in the other, she crossed into death. Cold hit her, and the relentless current, but she stood where she was, still feeling the warmth of life on her back. This was the very interface between the two realms, where she would normally plunge ahead. This time she planted her feet against the current, and used her continuing slight contact with life as an anchor to hold her own against the waters of death. Everything seemed quiet, save for the constant gurgling of the water about her feet and the far-off crash of the first gate. Nothing stirred, no shapes loomed up in the grey light. Cautiously, Sabriel used her sense of the dead to feel out anything that might be lurking, to feel the slight spark of the trapped but living spirit of the young man. Back in life, she was physically close to him, so she should be near his spirit here. There was something, but it seemed further into death than Sabriel expected. She tried to see it, squinting into the curious grayness that made distance impossible to judge, but nothing was visible. Whatever was there lurked beneath the surface of the water. Sabriel hesitated, then walked towards it, carefully feeling her way, making sure of every footfall, guarding against the gripping current. There was definitely something odd out there. She could feel it quite strongly. It had to be the trapped spirit. She ignored the little voice at the back of her mind that suggested it was a fiercely devious dead creature, strong enough to hold its own against the race of the river. Nevertheless, when she was a few paces back from whatever it was, Sabriel let run a sound, a muffled, sleepy peal that carried the sensation of a yawn, a sigh, a head falling forward, eyes heavy, a call to sleep. If there was a dead thing there, Sabriel reasoned, it would now be quiescent. She put her sword and bell away, edged forward to a good position, and reached down into the water. Her hands touched something as cold and hard as ice, something totally unidentifiable. She flinched back, then reached down again, till her hands found something that was clearly a shoulder. She followed this up to a head, and traced the features. Sometimes a spirit bore little relation to the physical body, and sometimes living spirits became warped if they spent too long in death, but this one was clearly the counterpart of the figurehead. It lived, too, somehow encased and protected from death, as the living body was preserved in wood. Sabriel gripped the spirit form under the arms and pulled. It rose up out of the water like a killer whale, pallid white and rigid as a statue. Sabriel staggered backwards, and the river, ever eager, wrapped her legs with tricksome eddies, but she steadied herself before it could drag her down. Changing her hold a little, Sabriel began to drag the spirit form back towards life. It was hard going, much harder than she'd expected. The current seemed far too strong for this side of the first gate, and the crystallized spirit, or whatever it was much, much heavier than any spirit should be. With nearly all her concentration bent on staying upright and heading in the right direction, Sabriel almost didn't notice the sudden cessation of noise that marked the passage of something through the first gate. But she'd learned to be wary over the last few days, and her conscious fears had become enshrined in subconscious caution. She heard, and listening carefully, caught the soft slosh-slosh of something half wading, half creeping, moving as quietly as it could against the current, moving towards her. Something dead was hoping to catch her unawares. Obviously, some alarm or summons had gone out beyond the first gate, and whatever was stalking towards her had come in answer to it. Inwardly cursing herself for stupidity, Sabriel looked down at her spirit burden. Sure enough, she could just make out a very thin black line, fine as cotton thread, running from his arm into the water, and thence to the deeper, darker regions of death. Not a controlling thread, but one that would let some distant adept know the spirit had been moved. Fortunately, sounding Rana would have slowed the message, but she was close enough to life. She increased her speed a little, but not too much, pretending she hadn't noticed the hunter. Whatever it was, it seemed quite reluctant to close in on her. Sabriel quickened her pace a little more, adrenaline and suspense feeding her strength. If it rushed her, she would have to drop the spirit, and he would be carried away, lost forever. Whatever magic had preserved his living spirit here on the boundary couldn't possibly prevail if he went past the first gate. If that happened, Sabriel thought, she would have precipitated a murder rather than a rescue. 4 steps to life, then 3. The thing was closing now. Sabriel could see it, low in the water, still creeping, but faster now. It was obviously a denizen of the 3rd, or even some later gate, for she couldn't identify what it once had been. Now it looked like a cross between a hog and a segmented worm, and it moved in a series of scuttles and sinuous wriggles. 2 steps. Sabriel shifted her grip again, wrapping her left arm completely around the spirit's chest and balancing the weight on her hip, freeing her right arm, but she still couldn't draw her sword or clear the bells. The hog thing began to grunt and hiss, breaking into a diving, rushing gallop, its long, yellow-crusted tusks surfing through the water, its long body undulating along behind. Sabriel stepped back, turned, and threw herself and her precious cargo headfirst into life, using all her will to force them through the wards on the sinkhole. For an instant, it seemed that they would be repulsed. Then, like a pin pushing through a rubber band, they were through. Shrill squealing followed her, but nothing else. Sabriel found herself face down on the ground, hands empty, ice crystals crunching as they fell from her frosted body. Turning her head, she met the gaze of Mogget. He stared at her, then closed his eyes and went back to sleep. Sabriel rolled over and got to her feet, very, very slowly. She felt all her pains come back and wondered why she'd been so hasty to perform deeds of daring-do and rescue. Still, she had managed it. The man's spirit was back where it belonged, back in life. Or so she thought, till she saw the figurehead. It hadn't changed at all to outward sight, though Sabriel could now feel the living spirit in it. Puzzled, she touched his immobile face, fingers tracing the grain of the wood.
"A kiss,"
Mogget said sleepily.
"Actually, just a breath would do."
"But you have to start kissing someone sometime, I suppose." Sabriel looked at the cat, wondering if this was the latest symptom of cat balm-induced lunacy, but he seemed sober enough, and serious. "A breath?" she asked. She didn't want to just kiss any wooden man. He looked nice enough, but he might not be like his looks. A kiss seemed very forward. He might remember it and make assumptions. Like this? She took a deep breath, leaned forward, exhaled a few inches from his nose and mouth, then stepped back to see what would happen, if anything. Nothing did. "Cat balm!" exclaimed Sabriel, looking at Mogget. "You shouldn't—" A small sound interrupted her, a small wheezing sound that didn't come from her or Mogget. The figurehead was breathing, air whistling between carved wooden lips like the issue from an aged, underworked bellows. The breathing grew stronger, and with it, color began to flow through the carving, dull wood giving way to the luster of flesh. He coughed, and the carven chest became flexible, suddenly rising and falling as he began to pant like a recovering sprinter. His eyes opened and met Sabriel's, fine gray eyes, but muzzy and unfocused. He didn't seem to see her. His fingers clenched and unclenched, and his feet shuffled as if he were running in place. Finally, his back peeled away from the ship's hull. He took one step forward and fell into Sabriel's arms. She lowered him hastily to the ground, all too aware that she was embracing a naked young man, in circumstances considerably different than the various scenarios she'd imagined with her friends at school, or heard about from the earthier and more privileged day girls.
"Thank you,"
he said, almost drunkenly, the words terribly slurred. He seemed to focus on her, or her surcoat, for the first time, and added, "Abortion." Then he went to sleep, mouth curling up at the corners, frown dissolving. He looked younger than he did as he fixed expression figurehead. Sabriel looked down at him, trying to ignore curiously fond feelings that had appeared from somewhere. Feelings similar to those that had made her bring back Jacinth's rabbit. "I suppose I'd better get him a blanket," she said reluctantly, as she wondered what on earth had possessed her to add this complication to her already confusing and difficult circumstances. She supposed she would have to get him to safety and civilization, at the very least, if there was any to be found. "I can get a blanket if you want to keep staring at him," Mogget said slyly, twining himself around her ankles in a sensuous pavane. Sabriel realized she really was staring and looked away. "No, I'll get it. And my spare shirt, I suppose. The breeches might fit him with a bit of work, I guess. We'd be much the same height. Keep watch, Mogget. I'll be back in a minute." Mogget watched her hobble off, then turned back to the sleeping man. Silently, the cat padded over and touched his pink tongue to the charter mark on the man's forehead. The mark flared, but Mogget didn't flinch, till it grew dull again.
So,
muttered Mogget, tasting his own tongue by curling it back on itself. He seemed somewhat surprised and more than a little angry. He tasted the mark again and then shook his head in distaste, the miniature sereneth on his collar ringing a little peal that was not of celebration.